an episode about Stalin. It proved quite popular. We covered only part of his life, and we stopped around the late 1920s. So I would suggest you go and watch this. I'm sure Daniel will put it on a link. But here's a very quick recap. So even if you haven't watched the first episode, you can follow today. So we talked about how the Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, rose to power with the revolution, the two revolutions of 1917, how they won against all odds, mostly through the political genius of Lenin, through their commitment, and through the fact that all their enemies inside and outside the country, but also their allies, completely undermined them. So we talked about how when they came to power, there was a very bloody civil war, but through this civil war, they had and more of the country under their control through the Red Army. And also we talked how they put their ideas into action through real communism, through the abolition of private property, through collectivizing the economy, particularly in the urban centers at that point, and how the results were exactly what you would expect: starvation, hunger, and persecutions and political unfreedom. Now, so we will begin by where we left. And today we're going to see Stalin's role way more in a way which is clearer. So today we'll focus more on Stalin than we did last week. So when it comes to Stalin, to understand his actions and to understand what happens in the bloody decade of the 1930s, we need to pause in one moment, which is the 26th of March of 1922. So Lenin, the leader of the revolutions, in March 22, he has the first of 3 strokes. These strokes would claim his life within 2 years and would basically incapacitate him, make impossible for him to continue to be on power. So before the stroke, Lenin had given to Stalin the position of the general secretary of the party, a position that did not exist. So with Lenin being invalid basically in his home, Stalin found himself with all the power in his hands. But at the same time, there were other prominent Bolsheviks. There was Trotsky, the hero of the Civil War, Zinoviev, Kamenev, all these big names. So while Lenin is is recovering from his first stroke, he writes, allegedly, because we're never sure who wrote this, his political testament. And what does he write in his political testament? He's criticizing every leader of every prominent Bolshevik, but particularly for Stalin. He writes that Stalin has a violent character and maybe he should be relieved from his duties as general secretary. This letter, which again, we're not sure if Lenin actually wrote it because he could not write, his secretary was writing, and there's suspicions that it's actually his wife, Krupskaya, who didn't like Stalin at all, who wrote this letter. So why is this letter important? Stalin appears as the pupil of Lenin, as a student of Lenin. This is his biggest legacy, that I'm just following on Lenin's steps. So over his head, as the sword of Damocles, is this letter by Lenin who says, Comrade Stalin is not fit to be the general secretary. So in the following years, 6 times, a butthurt Stalin says to the Central Committee, look, many of you keep bringing this letter up, therefore I resign. And actually, he was serious. 6 times Stalin resigns in the next years. None of these times his resignation is accepted by the rest of the leadership of the Bolsheviks. And this is one of the big what-ifs of history. What would have happened if the prominent Bolsheviks, who later would perish under Stalin, would have accepted his resignation? And why was Stalin's resignation not accepted? Because the rest of the Bolsheviks realized that Stalin was the only one during these years that could do what had to be done. And what had to be done was the forced collectivization of the land. Remember, in the early 20s, one of Lenin's last policies while he was still capable of leading the Bolsheviks was the so-called new economic policy. So remember, we had famine, we had economic collapse. So Lenin realizes that communism is going to fail very, very quickly. So he reintroduces elements of something like a market. So he allows people who used to be the middle classes, industrialists, small owners, to go back to their work. They would still operate under the auspices of the state, but they would have some freedom. So as time went by, in the late 20s, the plan was, okay, now we need to go back to socialism. And this was relatively easy to be done in the town because Bolsheviks had a lot of control in the urban centers. But what do you do in the countryside? We're talking about a country of 2 continents, a huge country. The communists had very little control in the countryside, and there was only 1% of the arable land that was voluntarily socialized. What does socialized mean? Not farmers running their own piece of land, but farmers together running all of the land. So in order to have socialism, you need to have a common, let's say, property on land. So everyone works the land together and they give whatever they make to the state, to a common pool. So towards the late 20s, everyone looks at Stalin and says, this is the only guy who can do it. This is the only guy who can spill the blood that needs to be spilled for the forced collectivization. And indeed, Stalin spills that blood. Stalin perfectly well knows that this is a key moment. Without collectivization, you don't have the control of all the grain from the state. And the big plan will be, we will export grain and we will import machinery, which means we will be able to industrialize. So without collectivization, you have no socialism to begin with, and also you cannot have industrialization. So through sending the army, through sending committed communists from the urban centers, through terror, through legislation that was absolutely draconian, Stalin from 1929 to 1933 manages the impossible, the collectivization of the land. Now, in terms of what happened during that time and the terror that took place, it's one of the most violent moments of the 20th century, the forced collectivization of the land. And it's related to something that many of you might have heard, which is the Ukrainian famine. I will explain why I think the term Ukrainian famine is a bit misleading. So 3 bad things happened during that time. The first is obviously the political violence. So a lot of the time, this collectivization of the land would happen literally with the guns of the Red Army. Another thing was quotas. So for example, you would go to a village and you'd say, let's say, in that particular village, if you don't collectively bring me X amount of crops or of whatever I want to export, you are all going to exile, internal exile. You are all going to gulags, collective responsibility, something which most people have in mind as relevant to fascism, but it was the official policy and the official decrees of the Soviet Union. Also, at the same time, we have a legislation drafted by Stalin himself that says that if you steal a single piece of grain, a single part of quote collective property, you are executed or you're going to prison for life. And it's quite telling that when Stalin comes up with this law, it's on page 8 of Pravda. And one of the high-ranking Bolsheviks says, no, this shouldn't be on page 8, this should be on the front page. So the terror of the collectivization is official state policy. And this is very interesting because many people think we found out about the crimes of the Soviet Union when it collapsed and we opened the archives. No, the terror, the crimes were there in your face. And how so many people in the West, both communists but also non-communists, fell for thinking that this was a novel experiment or whatever, I cannot understand it. So what was the result of the forced collectivization? Exactly what you would expect. Famine, horror, and the hunger that reached the levels of cannibalism. and 5 to 7 million people perished from hunger. Why? Because, of course, when you use the land under this collectivized scheme, all sorts of incentives, of supply and demand, of having the crops or the fertilizers you need. If the economy is centrally planned, the result is always the same. And in this case, it was famine and terror. Now, why did I say that this is what we have heard as the Ukrainian famine, but I think it's misleading? Because although most of the victims were in Ukraine, there was actually famine all over Soviet Union. And it, at least that's my personal view, Ukraine was not particularly targeted by Stalin. So most of the people were there. Stalin knew very well that famine would follow, but I don't think that he had something particularly against Ukrainians. Again, he knew that millions would perish, and yet he went through this policy. So one of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century, again, very few people know about it. What a shame. So the victims were 5 to 7 million, but also there were millions of people who were in internal exile or who ended up in gulags. Why? Because during the hunger, they would put aside some pieces of grain to feed their family. And again, this was a crime. Talk about the system that was supposedly for brotherly love and all that stuff. So why was the collectivization of 1933 a key moment? For two reasons. One, because it was this tragedy that I explained its magnitude, but also because it was the time when Stalin would see who is really serious about communism, who is really serious about the blood that needs to be spilled. And if you were not enthusiastically in favor of the collectivization, Stalin would not forget. And within a few years, you'd find it hunting you, which is one of the next things that we will see. Okay, first question, first break for a super chat by Robert, who asks, how does the impotence of evil and the idea that we never had to take any of it seriously apply to world leaders like Mao, Stalin, and Pol Pot? So the impotence of evil and the banality of evil is something that I'll get back to. But actually, let me finish the whole story and then we'll get back to this question because it relates also to what we're going to say from now on. So, famine, disaster. How does the Soviet Union survive? Well, again, the West comes to the rescue. Not in the form of a charity through the American Relief Administration, as it happened in the early 20s, but this time through two means. The one was direct investments from the West to Soviet Union. Stalin was very lucky that his collectivization process coincides with the Great Recession of the Great Financial Crisis of 1929. So many Western companies are desperate for clients. Stalin shows up and says, hey, invest in me. So they invest in Soviet Union. Ford, for example, Henry Ford builds a huge factory in somewhere in Nizhny Novgorod. And many people think Soviet Union is a good place to do business. Soon, for various reasons, they realized that this was not a good idea. But another way that Stalin industrialized Soviet Union was through his vast networks of spies that he had in the apparatus of the West. So, for example, supposed exchange students from Soviet Union would go to the United States. The United States would welcome them. Yes, sure, why not have cultural exchange with this great country? And these people would either went back to the Soviet Union and bring trade secrets and all that stuff with them, or they would stay in the US as spies and do industrial espionage. For more on that, watch my Ocon talk from this year's Ocon when it becomes available. It's gonna be soon rather than later. It should be one of the next months. So the second key moment, and the moment that unleashes one of the biggest horrors in human history, which is the period of the Great Terror, the period of the purges or the period of the Moscow trials. You might have heard it in under different titles, is 1934. So what happens in 1934 is that in Leningrad, former Petersburg, or Petrograd, Sergei Kirov, who was the party secretary in Leningrad, is assassinated. Now, Kirov was one of the very, very few people that Stalin would call a friend. There are many conspiracy theories about who assassinated Kirov. Many people say it was Stalin behind it. I think this is not the case. Stalin was genuinely appreciated Kirov. They were genuinely good friends. Actually, Kirov is assassinated by a random guy with whom he had beef. Some people think Kirov wanted to sleep with his wife. But anyway, it was more like a personal beef between the assassin and Kirov himself. But the assassination of Kirov opens the floodgates of paranoia and of persecutions that would go on for years. Stalin immediately goes to Leningrad, and very soon, although it's clear who the killer is, he signs a decree, he signs a law that basically says summary trials and executions for people who are suspected for terrorism. So terrorism now becomes the big thing. Previously, it was things like sabotage. So if the state wanted to eliminate you, they would say you're a saboteur. Now we have the idea of terrorism. And the idea was, if you are against the party, objectively, you want to eliminate the party leadership, which is what happened with the case of Kirov. Therefore, you're morally responsible for terrorism. So your ideas are morally responsible for crimes, which is what comes to my mind these days when I hear the term quote hate crime or incitement to violence because someone wrote a tweet that some people didn't like. So these ideas have been historically popular among dictatorships. So Stalin, immediately after the murder of his friend Kirov, signs this law. Soon there are more laws being signed, which says that basically the secret police can arrest you without any procedure. And we have the floodgates being open. So although it's clear who killed Kirov, and it was a lone shooter, a lone murderer, a lone assassin, as we'd say today, only for the case of Kirov, 6,500 people end up persecuted and executed. And this was only the beginning. In the next years, and particularly in 37 and in 38, Stalin releases the Great Terror, which means many key party members and people with whom Stalin had beef, like Kamenev, Zinoviev, or Bukharin, these were key Bolsheviks, but he had beef with them from the past, and he would link them to different supposed plots as being allies of the Nazis, who were already in power in Germany, as being spies of imperialism. And then you would arrest, let's say, 5 people. Then you would arrest everyone around them. And then you would torture them. Everyone knew that the accusations were made up. But made up accusations means you can be creative with them. It means, for example, that I arrest you and I torture you to sign that you are a spy of Nazis, of fascism, and of imperialism, and you work with these 10 other people. Then I arrest these 10 other people, and then I torture each one of them, and they give me 100 other names. So it's like a geometrical progress of arresting and torturing people for no evident reason. And notice that this is also a time where torture is legal. Stalin openly puts on the table, we're going to use power on these people. He means physical torture, and physical torture is officially the line and officially a policy. Then these people, completely broken, are brought to the show trials, to public trials. These were trials that were taking place literally in theaters, cinemas, because there were audiences outside. They were screaming, protesters wanting their heads. And these people were completely broken from the torture and for threats of their family. So the idea was, we're going to give you a script, you're going to play by this script, and maybe we're going to let you leave. Most of the times they wouldn't let them leave, or we're going to let your family leave. And we see the weird spectacle, people in these show trials accusing themselves, saying, look, I was a pig, I was an imperialist jackal. There is no way for me to atone for the crimes I've done. Or we see the weird spectacle of the public prosecutor speaking like a hooligan and like a thug and using curse words against the defendants, and the defendants also applauding the guy who was telling what a pieces of horrible people they were. So in this time we have this absolute period of madness. In some way, there was no country where it was more dangerous to be a communist than Soviet Union, because the vast majority of the leadership of the Bolsheviks, the vast majority of the leadership of the army, we're talking about 90% of high army officials, are being persecuted and are being liquidated. And also we have the disgusting spectacle also of collective responsibility, which means if you actually admit with the made up scripts that you are an enemy of the people, then also we're going to go after your wife and sometimes also your kids, even though we promise you that we will spare your family. So again, collective responsibility is official party policy. So how many people perished during that time? There were more than 1 million arrests. Official deaths in terms of execution is around 600,000, but we also need to add the people who perished during torture or who disappeared. So we go to something like 800,000 people. Put into perspective, the whole death toll of the Spanish Civil War was 500,000 people. And at the same time in Soviet Union, we have 800,000 people only from this internal purge. And you would ask again, how is it that so many people were purged? And again, the answer is because each person would have to give a list of how many people he knew. Therefore, if you're an enemy of the people and you name someone else, they were accomplices. But also, if you were arrested and your friend was not arrested, but didn't tell to the police that you're an enemy of the people, it could mean that he's an accomplice. For example, let's say Razi is arrested and he names after torture that Michael and Daniel are enemy of the people. He doesn't name me, but the secret police knows I'm a friend of Razi, and they come to me and say, look, Razi is an enemy of the people, but you didn't tell us. Therefore, you're also an enemy of the people. So here you come. And in some places in the countryside, there were even quotas. So the local secret police needed to arrest 50 people. And we had some crazy stories, like the secret police bursting into party meetings and arresting random people, whoever was there, because they had to fulfill a quota. So this is how we end up with this ridiculous amount of people being arrested. So during that time, according to the best numbers that we can have, 1 in 170 people perished in the purges. 1 in 170, not the 1 in 170 of adult people, 1 in 170 of everyone was persecuted. And this terror was also exported abroad. You might have heard about the Spanish Civil War, the Republicans together with the anarchists and the communists versus this weird coalition of royalists, fascists, phalangists, ultra-conservatives, and all that. What you might not know is what was the Soviet Union's main intervention in that war. So we remember the Soviet Union as the only country together with Mexico that helped the Republic. And this is true, although they didn't do it for free. But what is interesting is that Stalin sent to Spain a specific group of people who were from the secret police, and their main target was not the fascists. The main target was initially the anarchists, but also Trotskyists in Spain. Remember, Trotsky was the main enemy of Stalin. And although he was in exile in 1929, Stalin was, Trotsky was the main goal of his purges. So he would want to find Trotskyists everywhere. The number one accusation that could come your way is that you're a Trotskyist. So there were some Trotskyists in Spain, But the main opposition party in Spain of the communists, so in Spain you had the Republicans, a few, the communists, the anarchists, and then a party called PUM, which was an extra parliamentary left of what we'd call today a party. So they were communists, but not Stalinist. So in Stalin's eyes, they were Trotskyists. So he liquidated them completely. And the NKVD arrested their leader, a guy called Anders Nin, and they did the following unbelievable thing to him. First of all, they tortured him because they wanted him to admit that he was a spy of the Germans, that he was an agent of the Nazis and all that stuff. Crazy things. So Nin dies from the torture in the interrogation, and now the Soviets need to find out what are we going to do with his body, because everyone was asking, where is Nin? So they had him in a house outside in somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and they try to find what we're going to do with the body. So here's what they come up with. They take 2 Germans from the international brigades. These were volunteers who went to Spain to fight for the Republic. They dress them as Nazis, and they send them to the central prison where supposedly Nin, the Trotskyist, was, supposedly to free Nin, supposedly to free their agent. And when they left, they, quote, forgot behind them some Nazi paraphernalia, some Nazi like uniform stuff. So this is the level of really ridiculous propaganda that the communists would use. And of course, all of their supporters, or most of their supporters, would buy it. And they would say, yes, of course, Trotskyists are agents of the Nazis, only Stalin and the communist parties are following the proper party line. So to cut the long story short, in Spain, when Stalin gets rid of the Trotskyists and of anyone who was not an Orthodox communist, slowly loses his interest and he stops helping the Republic. Anyway, so there's one more big thing that we need to discuss. We're going to do it in a 3rd episode because I don't want this to be too long. This is the build-up towards the invasion of Germany and the relationship between Stalin and Nazi Germany, which is a very interesting one. Remember, part of the reason why the Great Purge happens is because supposedly all these people are Nazi spies and Nazi agents. So, for example, the greatest minds in the Soviet military, a guy called Tukhachevsky, is arrested, tortured, and executed as a Nazi spy. And actually, if you see his, how you call it, where he signs his confession has a big red mark on it, which is literally Tukhachevsky's blood from the torture. So we have the weird thing that from 36 till 38, Stalin goes after the leadership of the party and the army and of the diplomatic services and of foreign communist parties and liquidates them as agents of fascism. And a year later, what do we have? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and Nazi Germany and Soviet Union becoming suddenly friends. But this is for a future episode. So what's the biggest takeaway here? Instead of a takeaway, I will pose a question. And my question is, why? Why did Stalin have to do the Great Terror? I understand why he had to do the forced collectivization. Within the context of a communist, this makes sense. So there are things that are evil, but within the context of evil, they make sense. For example, the Holocaust is an ultimate evil, an unbelievable evil. And yet it makes sense within the context of being a Nazi and an anti-Semite. Hitler says, I want to eliminate the Jews. I will do it. The rape of Nanjing, for example, this monstrosity by the Japanese in that Chinese town. It makes sense. It's horrendous, but it makes sense. You've got people who are racist, you are people who are militarist, and they want to eliminate and to destroy people who they consider inferior. But the Great Purge makes no sense to me. Stalin had already consolidated his power. Stalin had no reason to go after the vast majority of the heroes of the revolution and present them as spies. And Stalin was already in the process of being the undisputed leader and of building socialism in Soviet Union. This is why it's one of the periods in human history that is of the most interest to me. Because it's not the banality of evil, it is the, how to put it, the fact that evil makes here no sense. Even within the context of communism, even within the context of collectivism, the period of the great purges, the period of the great terror makes no sense to me. And now we can go to your super chat. So Robert talks about the impotence of evil. So the impotence of evil applies in the case of Soviet Union because Soviet Union would not have survived without help from the West, not once, but twice. In 1920, in the early 20s, with the help they got from the American Relief Administration, led by Hoover. Watch my Ocon talk when it becomes available, or we can do also a daily objective only on that topic. They wouldn't have survived without, they wouldn't have industrialized at least without the investments from the West. Probably they wouldn't have won the war, the Second World War, or at least they wouldn't have stormed half of Europe without the help of the West, help that they got during the war, but also through their spying or through the deals they did with the West in terms of how they built their military industry. For example, you've heard about the T tanks, the T series, the letter T, and there are various tanks in this, which was a major weapon of Soviet Union in Second World War. What you might not know is that the military industry of Soviet Union, a big part of it was based on technology that they imported from the West with the West knowledge before the Second World War. So this is how I understand the impotence of evil applying in the case of Soviet Union. But even within the Soviet Union, think about it this way. If the good people, the productive people had not contributed during either the beginning of the revolution or during the new economic policy, then the regime would have collapsed. I'm not saying that they should have done something else, because when you have a gun against your head, it's very difficult to resist. But what I'm saying is that Soviet Union did not triumph because of Stalin's genius or because of the success of central planning. It managed to survive because better people within the Soviet Union and abroad actually practically helped or morally sanctioned Soviet Union. Think about all the intellectuals in the West who, even when they knew all these crimes, they considered it either a paradise or a very worthwhile experiment. Now, in the case of Mao and Pol Pot, that's a bit more complicated. I'm not an expert in the history of Mao. Pol Pot also had support from the West, particularly having to do with the inter-communist conflicts at that time. That's another discussion. We can do a whole episode on Cambodia and Pol Pot. Many people say, who is the worst person in history, Mao, Hitler, Stalin, or Pol Pot? In terms of statistics, in terms of percentage, what part of your population you eliminated, Pol Pot is undisputed there. I would say, though, that Stalin, again, has this thing which is different from everyone else, different from Hitler, different from Mao, different from Pol Pot. And the question is, why? Why did he have to do the particular things he did? Again, he didn't go against people he hated. He didn't go against a different group. He didn't even do the egalitarian kind of massacres that Mao and Pol Pot did. He went against his own elite, his own people, against his own parts, against the people who brought communism to Russia. Of course, later he went against more people, but that's another discussion. So for me, Stalin is a bigger mystery than both Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao. Thank you very much, Marilyn, for your contribution. Thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you, Jonathan. Philosophical Zombie Hunter asks, is there any truth to Stalin that Stalin wanted to give power to the people and try to remove corrupt bureaucrats and even write a constitution? Very, very interesting point. So you could say that with Mao in China, the Cultural Revolution was something that gave more power to the masses. In Soviet Union, this was not the case. You could say there was some egalitarianism to the purges, that even if you are a low party bureaucrat, or if you're a member of the Central Committee, you had the almost equal chances to be liquidated. But the Great Purges was not a mass mobilization movement. So the masses were outside from the courts, celebrating the demise of the traitors and all the stuff. But it was not a process. It was a top, not a bottom up. It was a top down process. So it started from the top. I keep forgetting what top down is. Anyway, it starts from the elite and it goes downwards. So the quotas about the arrest come from the top. And there were many, many hundreds of death lists that Stalin himself signed. So it was a generational attack to the early bureaucracy. So a new generation of party apparatus comes forward, a generation 100% loyal to Stalin. And this is an explanation for the purges, although not an explanation that 100% makes me understand what happens. But it wasn't a mass mobilization. So the result was a new wave of people and the removal of the old bureaucracy, but it wasn't through mass mobilization that Stalin achieved that. Stalin had to be a complete psychopath, says Marilyn. Now, that's a very interesting thing. I don't think that Stalin was a psychopath. Here's why. Till this time, Stalin was in his mid-50s. Probably he was even older at that time. I can't remember exactly. But it's not many people. What they do with Stalin, they go back in his youth and they try to find something, or they say it was this moment where he still was bitter because of the letter by Lenin. And I might also have alluded to this. But I don't think that there was something that was in Stalin's character. Because again, why did it take him 50-something years to solve? I think that it takes that type of person to bring something like the forced collectivization or the millions of victims of the famines. The Great Purge is a great mystery, but the vast majority of people perished before that. And before that, with the forced collectivization, Stalin was a good communist. Sorry, communist, but in a way, only Stalin could have done this, in terms that to be a communist, you have to be a Stalin, and vice versa. Stalin becomes that person because he has to lead the country to full communism. There was no other way to bring up socialism without being what you describe as a psychopath. I would say a consciously violent person. It always comes back to ideas, philosophy, says Roberts, and at the end of the day, I think this is it. There are many things that Stalin could have avoided, but he wouldn't have avoided the mass violence. And notice also something else. Almost nothing that Stalin does is unique to Stalin. The quantity is unique, but everything else was already happening during Lenin years. The purges, the persecutions, the secret police, the clamping down of all sorts of rights, all these started from Lenin. So next time you talk to a communist friend, or to, you're not in Greece, so there are probably not many communists around. Next time you talk to a communist and say, oh, it was if only Lenin had appointed Trotsky, or if Lenin didn't have this stroke. No, probably things would be more or less the same. Stalin was the right person to lead a communist country because it takes such a killer to bring up this regime. So enough, I don't want to tire you more than 40 minutes. We're going to have a third episode at some point talking about the dynamic between Stalin and Hitler. Now, I owe a massive thank you to someone who doesn't even know me, Stephen Kotkin, who wrote this monumental work on Stalin. So the first episode we did in March was mostly on the first volume, Stalin, the Paradoxes of Power. The second volume is Stalin Waiting for Hitler. And the third volume will come out in a few years. Stephen Kotkin, the best historian I can recommend on the topic of Stalin. I almost feel guilty because so many of the ideas. So I was interested in this topic for years, but I haven't come across something better than Stephen Kotkin. Okay, upcoming 10 p.m. today, UK time, live on Earth with Robert and Amy Nazir. The point is, we never had to take any of it seriously, did we? Which also is interesting. It's almost, what's the opposite of the banality of evil? The benevolence of the good. So you got your dose of evil, 10 p.m. UK time, Robert and Amy, on a different note. Okay, that's all for today. We're soon going to be back at some point for a third episode on Stalin. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.